Hi, everybody. How we doing today? Is everybody enjoying actually seeing faces and people and all that? Is that amazing? Or are you already exhausted? Be honest. A little exhausted, a little overwhelmed? Thanks.
Both is fair.
Yeah, that's both is actually okay. Hey, listen, thanks for joining us today. Kendall, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kendall Van Dyke. I am a senior program manager on the SQL Server team. I've been at Microsoft for about 6 years now, and I joined the SQL Server team in July of last year. I'm responsible for the early adoption program for SQL Server 2022. I also own the Azure Edge version of SQL Server, so our IoT version of SQL, and the time series features that are coming into SQL 2022.
Yeah, we also put a broom on his back so he can sweep the room as he walks out, because you have to have multiple jobs. I'm Buck Woody. I'm a data scientist at Microsoft. I've been here about 16 years, and I know a lot of you and so on. Let's get a little picture of the room. You want to do that?
Sure.
No, not a picture. It's a metaphor. How many of you are developers in the room? You write code. Okay, I'll talk slower.
Ouch.
Oh, that was wrong. I'm not supposed to.
For the record, I like developers.
Okay, all right, I do too.
No matter what Buck says.
I'm a recovering developer myself. How many of you are developers full-time and you don't do much else? They're not asking you to do 15 other things. Okay, a few folks that are there, dedicated developers. How many of you have been developing for several years, like 5 or more years? Okay, how many folks are sort of new at development or development curious? Raise your hand if you're kind of new. Okay, we've got a pretty good group in here, so I'm going to cover a resource real quick. If you're new, and maybe even if you're not new, sometimes people will ask you, hey, my kid's graduating school, how does he learn to do that programming thing? Because he's really good at video games, so he's going to make a lot of money in tech. So we've got some folks like that. Let me pop over. I just want to show you a couple of resources. Something that's super important that you do need to know is that, here we go, there we go. Something you do need to know is that the view that you'll get from the downloads area for this session has all of the links and more that we'll show. So we're here 50 minutes. That's really super quick. We're going to show you a lot of new things. Some of them are not documented, so you'll see them here. Not documented yet because they're so new. And some of them are some things we've got resources on. This is actually an AKA link. It's a really useful tool. It's building an app using SQL Server site. And we have everything from Java, C#, Ruby, even Go, if you're into that. So if you've not been to this site, it will walk you through building everything you need to build against SQL Server. How many of you is the first time you've seen this site? Pretty interesting, isn't it? So you may go there and go, I've been developing a long time, but I'm going to take a look at that just to make sure I'm actually doing it right. We also have released, Anna Hoffman has released, working with the team. We got a little survey here. We're not going to do that one. Where'd your mouse go? There it is. She's developed a full stack serverless application learning path. Let me tell you what that does. If you work through Microsoft Learn and do a learning path, we will give you for free, no credit card required, an Azure environment to complete the path. It stays live for 24 hours and you can take it again. You can do as many times as you want. Here's an architecture guide to the application, and it even includes this new thing, Kendall, called IoT. Now let me tell you about that. Some of the young kids these days, they have small devices. Do you know they have the internet on phones now?
No kidding.
They do. And so this actually takes an IoT app approach to developing an application against SQL Server. So once again, you'll get these links a little bit later. And the last thing I want to tell you is yours truly, right here, Ken himself, actually writes into this blog, the Azure SQL Devs Corner. It's got really good blogs in here, and Kendall writes amazing blogs. He doesn't do 5-minute, here's what I had for lunch things. He does like full up training sessions in his blogs. How many of you have been to this site before, been to this site before? A couple folks. If you haven't, you need to be checking here. The other thing is when we release something new, we'll talk about it and show you how to use it. The folks that are actually writing it will write down their thoughts about what they're doing right here. So you need to be following these blogs. Wow, that's a lot. That is a lot of stuff. Let's go back to Slide World for a moment. We haven't even gotten off the first slide.
No, we need to get going.
We need to get
Yeah.
going. So that's aka.ms/SQL SQL Dev. How many of you say SQL? Raise your hand. How many of you say the more proper SQL? Raise your hand. Okay, no judgment here. Okay. So let's talk first of all about how you use SQL Server. And there's several ways.
You have it on Management Studio, right?
Sure, if you find a developer using Management Studio, you probably should be looking somewhere else. They're supposed to be using Azure
Data Studio. Sorry, that's where the cool kids are at these days.
As the good Lord intended.
Yes.
And so we'll be talking about that just in a little bit. We'll show you a demo of some things there as well. But before we get to connection enhancements, we need to talk about the way you can use SQL Server in code, because connecting to it isn't the only way to do that. And we'll talk about those methods in just a bit. But we have everything from the Entity Framework. Entity Framework folks in the room. ORM, loud and proud. Oh, you're keeping it on the down low? Oh, you're fighting
it.
Okay. You're on his team, and you use Entity Framework, and he fights it. Okay, this sounds like a great relationship. You sound like a normal shop then, is basically what you are. Okay, Entity Framework, don't make that face. ORM does have a place in coding. If you're used to object-oriented programming, you may see that we have made a bunch of new announcements. You'll find them in the link for Entity Framework. We also have things like a reactive connection method that you can use for sort of streaming apps, JavaScript, folks with JavaScript and so on, that has that full package for you there. We've made new enhancements in that as well. SQL XML model. How many of you have written a CLR inside SQL Server? How many of you know what a CLR is? Okay, let me explain that then.
Go for it.
Okay, we've got something called a common language runtime, which is, as you know, what .NET compiles down into in one of its steps. Inside SQL Server, you can write assemblies in C# or F# or whatever your love language is. You can compile the DLL and have SQL Server call it inside T-SQL code. So as a developer, you can hand code, server-side code, back to the DBA, allow it to run. There are security parameters around that. You can trust it, you can put it in a sandbox, and so on. So the CLR, the Common Language Runtime, is a way for you to push your business logic back into the database with all of its security and performance and sizing. So that's incredible. But then, of course, we think about, and there are other methods, by the way, but the main one we think about is how you connect to SQL Server. So the enhancements we've done inside connection and development include ORM, don't make that face, and connection updates. So we have made updates to things like ODBC and other connections, right?
Didn't we deprecate ODBC?
We did deprecate ODBC, and now we've updated it to a new version. We also have made some significant improvements to Microsoft.data.SQL client, both from a security perspective, which I'll show you in just a bit, performance, and there's also some feature updates inside there. We may touch on some of those inside the codes. Tedious developers, and that's not an adjective, it's a noun.
That means developing is hard?
No, it means it's, no, tedious developers, those of you who know what tedious is? No? Okay, you, the one with the Entity Framework guy. You're just an odd man out, aren't you? This whole thing, you're the only one using EF and you're using Tedious. He's feeling very alone right now. You should talk to him. He'll give you a free full class on how to use Tedious. You should be using it. It's a great product. It's not ours, but we've made some enhancements to the libraries underneath to make Tedious even better. And seriously, if you don't have that, write that down. Need to go learn about Tedious. We're not going to take the time to do that today. We have retry logic, and this is really nice. We've updated the core API, and we have enumerators now in your retry logic so that you can get beginning and end events and so on for your retries. This is becoming super important.
Why do we care about retry?
So in retry, I don't know, have you guys heard of this thing called the cloud? Anyone? No? Just in the States. So a lot of times you don't have really good connectivity. Is this thing on? Hello? Hello? All right, these are the best the jokes are going to get. This is it. We're all working on a little sleep. You got to give me something here. All right. The retry logic is for the fact that we don't always have good connectivity out to the cloud or even over to our other systems, right? And so you need a way to say, okay, if you don't connect, I may want to try another connection on a different server, or I may want to back off and retry again, and so on. We've made some pretty significant updates in here, so you definitely want to check those out. And there should be a trumpet fanfare, right?
This is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, and I know everybody else is laughing, but the idea is we now have distributed transactions. I know that's been kind of glaringly lacking, not from the SQL Server side, but from the connection libraries, the ability to distribute your transactions. This is huge. Do you have a demo on this one or no?
No, I don't, unfortunately.
Not on this one, but we do have documentation inside the links in just a bit. Good night, that's a lot.
It is.
That's a lot going on
but
there.
That's not even why we're here, right?
No, we're here for development enhancements, and I think you should take over for a little while. I'm tired of talking.
Okay.
All right.
I've got some candy for you. Now, Buck mentioned that some of the demos that you're going to see here today and some of the resources will be available in the downloads. What I'm about to show you will not be, and that's because we have not released SQL 2022 yet, even in public preview. I'm going to show you some things we have not shown publicly anywhere else yet. You get to see it for the very first time. So let's do some cool stuff. We've got a lot of enhancements coming in SQL 2022. Primarily the developers care about. There's all kinds of cool things that database administrators care about as well. But we love developers, so we want to add features that you'll appreciate. So I've got a lot to unpack in one slide. Don't worry, we're going to do a lot of demos. We've got 2 hours?
2 hours and 15 minutes.
Excellent, okay. We're going to talk about all these great new features. First is with Query Store hints. How many people have heard about Query Store before? Okay, excellent. About half the room. Why do developers care about Query Store?
They don't. You just type in select star from table and get everything back and do it all client side.
Oh, Buck. Developers should care about Query Store not only because it's a fantastic tool for DBAs to troubleshoot production. In fact, I think it's the best thing since sliced bread for troubleshooting production issues and seeing performance. But developers should really care because how many times developers have you asked for access to production? What do you usually get it?
Let's ask Mr. Tedious.
Do you?
You have production access?
It's a mess.
I just
think that
heard a gasp. Did you say SSMS or it's a mess? I just heard a collective gasp in here. Everyone's envious of you now.
Usually developers don't get access to production. How in the world do you know how production is performing when you're a developer, right? We don't care about just writing code and getting it out the door. We want to make sure our stuff works and performs well. Query Store captures that data. And using something like a dbcc clone database command, your production DBAs can give you a copy of that data, that data from production that gives you insight into performance metrics. So in your sprints and your planning cycles, when you have time, to focus on performance tuning, you have that data available to you. Query Store is a fantastic resource, not just for keeping the wheels turning in production, but for developers to get deeper insights into how their databases are performing. And we are leveraging Query Store for a lot of really cool enhancements in SQL 2022. The first of which is Query Store hints. Now, classic problem with SQL Server, especially I'm going to pick on the ORMs here, right? You have no control over your code sometimes that's running because it's been generated by an ORM. You can see it in production. You can see it isn't working well, but there's nothing you can do about it because the code lives back in the application. So as DBAs, we're left to all kinds of tricks and workarounds, things like plan guides, which are like you're a super ninja if you know how to make plan guides work. Or we can leverage Query Store. With the new Query Store hints feature, we can apply hints on code that we would otherwise not be able to touch. So I'm going to give you a quick demo of this.
Yeah, you have something you can show us?
I do.
Oh, wow.
So first things first, I am running SQL Server CTP 2022 CTP 1.3, and you can see that in Object Explorer, and I'll run a select data version. I'm typing in a demo. I'm sorry, Buck.
Dude, you're killing me. Just make the font bigger.
Oop, we'll make it text. There we go. So there we are. We're on CTP 1.3 of 2022. So you can see I'm not lying. There's no tricks up my sleeve in how this works. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do, Now, you might be wondering, by the way, why? We said the cool kids use Azure Data Studio. Why in the world am I using Management Studio?
Right.
That's because some of this stuff is so new that Azure Data Studio breaks on this.
Oh, wow.
So we have to use Management Studio. And also, just for fun, because I'm gonna tease you about this, I'm using a preview version of Management Studio.
Wow.
So we have a new version coming at some point in the future that doesn't break when I run these
So
demos.
you're using all unreleased software on your laptop, and you're typing in a demo.
I live life on the edge.
Wow. I'm going to sit back here.
Okay, what we're going to do is the setup here is we're going to use this database called Property MLS. It's got some MLS listings from the United States. And we're going to just turn on Query Store. We're going to clear out all the data from Query Store. And we'll see that Query Store is in read-write mode. All right, Query Store is in read-write mode now. Next thing that we're going to do is look at this new system view. Now, for those of you who are developers and DBAs or care about Query Store, there is a new table that we can look at, sys.querystore query hints, where we can see these query hints that have been applied by the engine or by you, the DBA. And we can see there's no hints right now. So what we're going to do is also take a look at, we're going to run a stored procedure that's going to get some data back based off of an agent ID. And what we're going to do first is look at the stats histogram for this table that we're going to be selecting from the non-clustered index in particular. Okay? Now, this is not a deep dive in statistics, but classic problem of SQL Server is that sometimes you have a distribution of data that's skewed. One plan or one execution works great, another one doesn't work so great, because a seek might be better than a scan or vice versa, depending on the parameters that are passed in. So it looks like if we're looking at this histogram, that we have pretty even distribution of data until we get down here to the very end.
Okay.
Agent ID 101 has got 1 million rows or 100,000 rows worth of property listings. Now, if you've done any kind of performance tuning, you would know from experience that if the first call that I make to that agent results in a scan, and we're just going to look at the execution plan here alongside of this. Oops, let's take a peek. Let me turn on the actual plan. You see that we end up with this scan with parallelism. That might work great for the 100,000 row case. What ends up happening, though, when we use one of the average distribution scenarios? Well, we should have gotten that same scan, actually. We ended up not getting it for some strange reason, but maybe my hints were being applied. What we're going to do is look at the query ID that's associated with this query out of Query Store. We see it's query ID 4. Right? Now, what I'd like to do to prevent that scenario is let's stick an option recompile hint so that we don't always end up with a scan. We end up with a seek when it's appropriate, or we end up with a scan when it's appropriate.
Right.
So I'm going to run a stored procedure, SP query store set hints, and I'm going to stick on query ID 4 an option recompile hint. And we'll look again at sys.querystore query hints, and we'll now see that we have a row in this system catalog or in the system table that shows me an option recompile hint for that query. So now, anytime that query ID 4 runs, for the cases where we need a scan, we get a scan. And for the cases where we need a seek, we end up with a seek.
Oh, nice.
Now, let's go ahead and look at Query Store hints again. And we can see that we haven't had any failures. We've got a few extra columns in here to give you an idea about when Query Store hints fail, the number of times that they fail, and why they fail, so you can see if your hints are maybe detrimental instead of helping. Okay? Now, there's nothing in here that's going to remove this automatically because you've manually added it. So when you find out that you have a query that you can fix in code after you've had the chance to let things cool down from the production fire, then you can come back and remove this Query Store hint. Okay? And now once it's gone, you see we don't have any rows in the table anymore. Now, why do I care as a developer? Well, that means I care less about having to really fine-tune that ORM code. I'm not saying you can be lazy and just write, bad ORM code. But sometimes it's inevitable. The ORMs just do it for you. There's no way you can get around skewed statistics distributions. So you can continue to write your code and worry less about having to really refine it and spend a lot of time on this one strange query where you maybe implement lots of if blocks or something else like that, or manually apply query hints in your code and let the engine take care of it for you. And you can see when you get that copy of the production database with that DBCC clone database, you can see if your DBAs have been applying hints, right? Or if potentially it's been automatically applied for you, which I'm giving you a hint about something else that's coming. See what I did there?
Yeah, I like that. I like that. You gave me a hint.
I gave you a hint.
Yeah, nice.
So this is the basis. Query store hints are the basis for some of the other features that we are adding into intelligent query processing, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But let's talk first about some of the enhancements to T-SQL functionality. Right? We know that writing T-SQL is a little bit of an art, it's a little bit of a science, a little bit luck on top of that, and we want to make it as easy as possible for you. We also realize that T-SQL is an ever-evolving language, and as we add more complexity into the engine, we need to make it easier for you to write code. So we're adding some enhancements to T-SQL functionality so that you don't have to implement crazy workarounds. So we're going to show a quick demonstration of some of these things. Some of these are already in Azure, and they're in different flavors of Azure. So keep in mind that our database engine is a shared code base across Azure and on-prem SQL. So that means if you see something show up in Azure, something like a T-SQL function show up in Azure, you should expect to see that T-SQL function show up in on-prem
and even
as
vice
well.
versa. You'll sometimes see things on premises that end up showing up in the cloud.
So what we're doing with a lot of these enhancements are they're already in Azure, we're bringing them to Box. So I'll just do a quick demonstration of some of these. I think they make code easier to write. So we're going to start with the greatest function. And I don't mean that this is the greatest function. I mean the function is called greatest. Right? Even though it is pretty great.
It is pretty great.
So we're going to use the AdventureWorks 2017 database for this. And a very simple example, I can pass multiple values. And this can be 3, 5, more, as many as we'd like, to find the greatest value. Now you might be thinking, this kind of looks like max, right? But with max, I would have to stick these values into something like a table valued parameter, and then I would pass that in and use max out of that column. This makes it a little bit easier.
No, I've used this, just playing around, I've used this quite a bit. How many of you think this might be useful in code you've got now? I mean, I would use, again, you said it's not the greatest feature. I don't know about that.
So notice, by the way, I've mixed and matched here as well. I've got some strings. I've got a numeric value. I've got a Unicode string as well. So precedence matters here. We boil up to the highest level of precedence when we're comparing values. So notice that greatest returns 7.00. That's because the numeric value has a higher precedence than the other values that were passed in, so they're automatically converted in their return for this. But this is neat. You can mix and match different data types in with this. You can also mix and match just string types. So depending upon your collation, if it's case sensitive or insensitive, you can get the greatest value out of alphanumeric strings.
This is great. Yeah.
We can also use this by passing in values from columns from a table.
That's nice. Very cool.
Right, so we can see we get the greatest value out of three columnar values here for each row.
Very cool.
Right? You can even use local variables. So we'll just create a table, we'll throw some values into this table, and we will assign some values to some local variables.
Okay.
And then we'll compare the two local values to each other, the local variables to each other, and do something based off of that. We can use this in this case as a filter on a with clause.
You see, this really shows off the power of Transact SQL. Learning something very simple like a select statement builds on things you use before that and after that and after that, and it becomes a chess game, right? Simple moves become very complicated. What you've done here with the select and then after that, it's amazing. It just absolutely builds on the power that it's already got.
Absolutely, and I realize I'm not getting rounds of applause for this. It's cool, it just works, and that's the point. It just works, it makes your life easier. One last demo for this is that we're going to mix and match columns, constraints, and variables and compare them all to each other with the greatest function. And you can see it really is the greatest, actually. We end up comparing, for each of our rows from our products tables, the column list price against the value 0 versus the variable. And we get the greatest value depending on what those column values versus the local variables are.
Yeah, and it's quicker than a jackrabbit on a date. That's really
It
nice.
absolutely is. It's a lot easier than writing lots of convoluted if statements to compare values to each other, so you're limited in max with some workarounds. This just makes this writing code a lot easier. Now we've also got a least, and to spare you, I'll just run a few of these, or 1 or 2 of these. It behaves exactly the same way as you would imagine. We just get the least value instead of the greatest value. Everything I just showed you with comparing local variables, columns, string types, mixing and matching, all applies to the least function as well. All right, let's take a look at string split. That's our next one. Working with strings in SQL Server is really easy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's my favorite.
It has not always been that easy. He's lying. We realize that splitting strings on a delimiter has often required some creative workarounds. Either you do it in the application code, or you write all kinds of convoluted functions on your own.
Class, accounts.
And it becomes pretty complicated. So split string was introduced in SQL 2016. You're probably wondering, why is he showing me this? This has been around for a while. We added something new to split string to help with performance, which is this enable ordinal column. This allows you to actually sort the results that come back from split string on the column that's being returned. So instead of having to split string into a table variable and then select back out with an order by clause, you can just get ordered results right away. So a quick demo of split string, if you haven't seen this, and then we'll get to the real demo, is we're just going to create a table that's got a product table that's got some comma delimited tags in here for each of the rows so that we can populate this table and show our demo. Now, split string, again, if you haven't seen it, it takes a variable or a column or a literal and then a delimiter as the most basic syntax. So if we wanted to split a comma delimited string, notice there is a blank in here. Only values that don't return as null actually get returned in the result set.
Oh, that's nice.
Okay, but notice this is not sorted. I have clothing, then road, then touring, then bike. Right? If I wanted to sort that, look, I'm typing in a demo again. If I wanted to sort that, I can add the ordinal parameter. And now notice, oh, it didn't sort it properly. Well, let me show you the demo that actually does sort it properly. So what we're going to do is actually go down to the end here, where we are going to order this by the ordinal column. That's because we get an extra column that comes back called ordinal that we would then put the order by clause on.
Right.
Okay. So it will not sort it automatically in the return table results, but your table gets an extra column to sort by. Now,
there you go. Yep.
We can sort a comma delimited string on any delimiter that we would like and sort it by an ordinal position.
Because that's useful because I might want to have it descending or ascending or whatever, so the order by actually has more control.
Absolutely, and this can also potentially help the optimizer in some cases if you have things like row goals that are in play, where we can select from the first couple of rows instead of having to read large amounts of data. Okay. So that's an enhancement that is in 2022 on top of what's already in 2016 and up. Okay. Now, something brand new to 2022, and I think this is really cool. This is, do you like sugar?
Yes.
You ate a candy bar in front of me earlier today, so I know you like sugar. He teased me.
Yeah, that's part of the food pyramid. Salt, sugar, and fat. That's the food pyramid.
Excellent. Yep. Well, how about syntactic sugar?
Okay, sure.
Right. Well, if I'm a developer, I like syntactic sugar.
Okay.
And that's what we've got with a new window clause for the select statement. Now, this is really cool because you can, just like a CTE, you can define your window clause as an alias and then reference that throughout your code. So again, we're going to use our favorite AdventureWorks database. And the syntax sample that you see up on the screen is essentially that we're going to provide a name called window, or the statement called window, and then a window name, and then the reference and syntax afterwards, right? So let's show it in action. So if we wanted to use a named window, this is the syntax I want to focus on here. Normally, we would have to supply in our over clause for window functions the partition by, the order by, all of the syntax that we need to supply here in order to make this work.
Lots of work.
Right? with our window clause, we can now alias this and then define that window clause elsewhere in our code. Notice there's some red squigglies on this. This is so new that even Management Studio thinks this is a syntax error. Okay? So our window clause for that particular statement is later on in our code. Our partition by, our order by statements are defined in this window clause. So we'll just go ahead and use this name window to run our sample code. And it just works.
Nice.
Really cool, right?
I like that.
Now, I typed more here to actually define an alias and the window function than if I had just typed the code.
Sure.
So in this simple example to show you how it works, it wouldn't make sense to use that window.
Sure.
But imagine when you have queries where you have the same window clause typed over and over and over again, or you need a just slightly different variation on that window clause as you are returning values in columns, right? So obviously, before that window clause, this would be a lot easier to type out. But let's make this a little bit more fun. We're going to skip down to where we're going to use named windows, and we're going to actually use them as what we call forward and backward references. We're going to have one window reference another window, and we're going to alter the order and the partition on all of these.
Nice.
And we can start to see where now this saves us some time in having to type out really complex statements. So we have, using named windows here, a sum column that uses named window 2, another sum column that uses named window 1, and our window functions are defined in this block. So we have named window 1 that references named window 3. And then we have, if we walk this backwards, named window 3 that has our partition by customer ID with an order by column, and named window 2, which has a partition by customer ID without an order by column. So now we're getting very similar syntax that we don't have to type multiple times, and we can modify using the forward and backward references. We can modify existing window functions so we can layer that on. We can build on top of each other.
Really useful for mobile apps where I've got a small screen and I've got to show a certain segment of data based on what the user's doing.
Once again, it just works. It's syntactic sugar. It's not fundamentally altering the query optimizer, the plans that get built. It is simply making code easier for you to write so that you can reference window clauses and modify them on the fly. One more demo for this one. We're going to actually nest these. So we have a window definition called customer ID window where we defined our partition and our order by. And you can see that we're referencing this multiple times. Or here's one reference to it in our over clause, and a second reference to it in our other over clause for the lead and lag functions. And it just works.
Nice. You know what's great about this is with the new SQL Server running inside containers, you can actually run the Windows on Mac. I'll sit down.
That you can,
I'll
yeah.
go ahead and sit down.
That's fantastic, thank you. Okay, let's keep moving. Now, in 2019, we introduced something called approximate count distinct. Technically, this is an IQP feature, intelligent query processing feature. This is for a scenario where we need to get a distinct count of values in a column, but that gets really costly in a really large data set because that requires loading pages from the buffer, from the disk into the buffer pool, and then all of our other applications freak out because all of a sudden we've got paging and buffer pool issues, and it's just a mess. So in scenarios where you're doing data science, you like data science,
Yes,
right?
sir, I do.
Instead of having to scan a table for all the values in a column to get that distinct count, we introduced approximate count distinct so that you can get close enough.
Right.
Because most of the time, close enough is good enough.
That's right.
Right? Well, we're going to build on that in 2022. And we have two functions that are building on the percentile DISC. So DISC would be discrete, and the percentile CONT, which would be the continuous. The difference being that discrete means you get actual values that are in your data, whereas continuous gives you interpolated values.
That's right.
Okay?
Yep.
So we're going to just do a quick example of how this works. Now, I want to point out that this is slightly different than the percentile equivalent functions. And that's because the percentile equivalent functions they're actual analytical functions. So they require some additional syntax for windowing. The approximate functions do not. And if you actually just try to replace the values for percentile continuous, for example, with approximate percentile continuous, you'll get errors. And that's because the approximate percentile functions are aggregate functions. They have non-deterministic nature associated with them, whereas the percentile equivalents are the analytical-based functions. So it's important that you'll have to modify your syntax just a little bit. So let's take a quick look at an example of, we'll populate an employee table with some values, and we would like to look at the percentile, the continuous percentile versus the discrete percentile, and we'll use the approximate percentile functions for these to get the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. Okay. Now, this is a really small data set, so these values probably match up exactly with what you would expect from the percentile scenarios one for one. But when we get to really large data sets where you've got millions or billions of rows, these functions are going to perform a lot faster. Okay. Just to show you it's not a direct replacement, notice that if we were to try to keep the order by with the over clause, we'll end up getting an error here. Okay. So syntactically, you'll have to change things just a little bit. So just to show you how this actually works in another sample database, we will use our friend Worldwide Importers, Buck's favorite. And notice that instead of a distinct keyword at the beginning, we're now using the group by keyword to actually group values together. And we don't have an over clause on our approximate percentile functions. And now we get the values back. Okay, so these are great for when you need results that are close enough, but not 100% accurate. They're close within a few percentage points of inaccuracy. Okay, let's take a look at JSON enhancements. We have a function called isJSON. Now, this was also introduced in an existing version of SQL Server in 2016. We are adding a parameter for the JSON type constraint, because not all data is just a JSON object. Sometimes the data is a value, sometimes it's an array, sometimes it's a JSON object itself, sometimes it's a scalar. So this is really just to bring our isJSON function up to spec with RFC code. And so we'll do a quick demo on this one. We can test, and I'm just going to jump to the end down here so you can see how each one of these work. With the optional parameter, we can test if the value true is considered a JSON value. We'll also check if a string with a space in it is considered a JSON value. And then we'll also check if that space with double quotes around it is a JSON value, a scalar value. And then we can check to see if a full JSON string is also a JSON object. So in the first example, it is a valid JSON value. The second example, because it has a space without quotes, is not a valid JSON value. With quotes is a valid JSON scalar. And then our last sample JSON document meets the criteria for being a full-blown JSON document. Okay? Again, not terribly exciting, but if you do lots of work with JSON data, this now opens up possibilities for you to work with data without having to specify everything as a JSON object.
Right. The other thing that's useful is to test to make sure your JSON is valid from a security perspective.
Absolutely. All right, now we have a new one for 2022 called JSON path exists. JSON path exists allows us, similar to XML path functions for checking for the existence of an XML path, we can do this now with JSON paths. So we'll have a quick example to see if in our sample JSON document for showing cities or towns, if a path of .info.address exists in that document. And we'll also do the same thing using literal values instead. So you can pass a variable, you can pass a literal, you can pass a column from a table if you'd like. Okay, and in both cases, that is a valid JSON path. Okay, so now we could do something. We could put this into an if statement. We could do something with that data to work with it if it is a JSON, if a particular JSON path exists versus not existing.
Exactly.
Okay. Whew. All right, let's look at time series functions. And time series exists in Azure SQL Edge today. This is our IoT offering of SQL Server. I have a session on Saturday if anybody is interested in learning more about this version of SQL, and I'll give you a teaser, $100 per year for the license cost. But don't, it's a very specific use case scenario. But come out and find out about it. I'd love to talk to you more about it. These functions have existed. We wrote them for the processing of time series data in SQL Edge. And we're bringing them to the box now, too, in 2022. Okay, so the first one that I'll give you an example is called date bucket. This allows us to create buckets using date time values defined with an offset from the origin value of January 1st, 1900. So we're going to, in a simple example, declare a date time, and then we're going to look at the number of date buckets in weeks since that date, number of days, hours, minutes, and seconds, and we'll just union all these together so we can see our results.
Get your database too.
Oh, would help if I'm in the right database, wouldn't it? Well, in that case, it's a
Yeah.
thing. Okay. So we can see in the way the date bucket returns, it's based off of 1/1/1900, and we can see the current bucket that these date times would fall into based off of that. This is important if we need to process data in buckets. Maybe sometimes we need to roll up data into hours or roll up data into minutes. So this will make, in the using date bucket, this will make it a little bit easier than those convoluted functions where we have to convert date times all around. And
in data science, we have to do this all the time.
Yep. All right, so I know we're running a little short on time. Let's go show you first value, last value. First value, last value were also added in 2016. They exist already, but we added some specific syntax into 2022 for ignore nulls and respect nulls. These allow you to either ignore null values in your data set when you're computing the last value in a partition, or to keep null values in that data set. Okay? So I'll just show you a quick example of this one and how it works. We'll just select some values from the production.product table. We'll order it by our list price, and we will figure out what the least expensive value is from a set of values for a particular subcategory. Okay? And so we get our results back, which is the least expensive value.
Very cool.
Okay? We also have last value, and as you can imagine, instead of it being the very first value, we would get the last value in that ordered by result set. Once again, I'll just show a quick run through of it. So you can see this would be the last value that's associated for the hire date, in this case, from each of these rates associated with these departments.
Very cool.
Okay. These are really great for processing time series data in data science kinds of operations.
Becoming more and more important.
Absolutely. Okay, last one. We're going to talk about generate series. Generating a series of data is not always easy, so we have a way now where you can simply generate a table of numbers. The syntax is pretty straightforward. We provide a start, a stop, and also a optional number of steps that you'd like to increment by. And you're going to notice the syntax for this is a little strange. It's a little bit different because you actually have to specify start equals, stop equals, and step equals. This is very similar to there's another data science function that I'm drawing a blank on, but it's in SQL where we have to specify these. It's not your typical syntax where you would just pass in the values in their ordinal position. So that's the one key thing I want to point out. And we'll just generate a series of data from 1 to 100. The default value for, it would help if I'm actually in the right connection for this.
So while we're working through this, one of the things to keep in mind about these kinds of things is that in data science, sometimes I need to generate data to test, to make sure I'm not overfitting or setting up a particular function that is getting the wrong value. As the difference in data science algorithms is you always get an answer. If you average two numbers, you'll get an average. It doesn't mean that that's correct. So we need to test our functions a lot with these kinds of things for that very reason.
All right, so you can see in the sample call, I get in series of 1, steps of 1, that's the default value. I can also specify I'd rather step from 1 to 100 in steps of 5 to generate these values. This is going to be great for generating values between dates, for example, or generating a range of numbers when you need to apply some data science functions.
Right.
Okay. We are going to bring, by the way, dates here as well, so we can generate series of dates. It's not in the current CTPs. We're still working on that, so I can't quite show that to you yet.
Wow.
Wow, we were running out of time, and I've got like 20 million things more to show you. So here's where we're going to stop with my demos and let Buck take back over. I want to talk very briefly about IQP before I hand it back to you, Buck.
All right.
I saved IQP for the last. If we had time to show these off, great. I'm going to encourage you to go to Pedro Lopes' session on SQL 2022 Deep Dives.
Definitely.
He is going to show off a lot of these. IQP are features that we introduced in SQL 2017 and 2019. They're in Azure as well. And the idea here is that your database will adjust on the fly. If you have an overgrant of memory, an undergrant of memory, if you have an overgrant of degree of parallelism, for example,
Yep.
the engine can adjust on the fly based off of the actual runtime conditions. What I will say about IQP, very briefly, is that in the past, a lot of these things have just persisted in the database, in memory, at runtime. So if your plan was flushed from the query store, if your plan was flushed from the cache, then you would lose the benefit of all these IQP features. We are now persisting these in Query Store. Some of these features will leverage Query Store hints that we talked about at the beginning. So to tie it all together, imagine you're the developer and you care about production performance. You will be able to now see where IQP features are kicking in and accommodating for bad distribution of data or odd distribution of data, and the query hints that the engine is applying for you automatically in the Query Store when you get your copy of that production database, the cloned database from your DBAs. So if I want you to remember nothing else about the IQP feature, is that valuable performance tuning data from production is available starting in SQL 2022 in the Query Store. So if you haven't used Query Store before for performance tuning, you have a really great reason to start using it and asking for your DBAs from production copies. Buck, you have a few more things to talk about.
We do. Good night. We've got so much else to cover. So we've done our demos here for 2022. But now let's talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, is security. There's quite a few security features that we've added in to SQL 2022. Here's just a few. How many of you were in the keynote this morning? Okay, you saw the demonstration I did with Bob, where Bob Ward tried to get past being detected that he had made a valid change into a database, all the way down to altering the physical pages on the hard drive outside of SQL Server. Here's the developer angle to that feature. You could be writing your trackability logs inside the SQL Ledger. This has been in Azure. We're bringing it on premises. This will allow you to make trackable actions inside your database that is immutable. No one can change it. They could alter the data, but you know that they did that. And this is using blockchain technology right inside the database without you having to go out. We also have new enhancements in the tabular data stream. We've upped our connections to TLS 1.3. For those of you that are in the security world, this is table stakes. You've got to do this now. We've done that. We have dynamic data masking. And what this does for you is you write a query, select star from table name, as we all do as developers, and depending on who you are, the same code returns different values. Oh, wow. So the DBA can say managers can see these columns, like finance, but they can't see like start date. And if I'm a manager and I run the same query, select star, it's almost like having a where or a view, but you don't have to change your code. Not your problem. You go get the data. The DBAs figure out who's allowed to see it. Really impressive. Always encrypted enhancements. For those of you that have been using Always Encrypted, which handles most of the legwork for encrypting your connections, data at rest, data in transit, we've got some enhancements there. We've got new service endpoint policies. So you can say what can connect to which endpoint, and we now have outbound firewall rules inside SQL Azure. And or Azure SQL DB. What you can do here is we've always had inbound firewall rules. Now we say you can send that data only back to these endpoints. So you can firewall both in and out. Good
so
night,
that's even if I can get in, I can't necessarily get data back out.
Correct. Even if I got in with a valid app, it's not going to go to the wrong server. We've got more enhancements. I mean, come on. We've got things like Azure SQL bindings for Azure Functions. You can bind a SQL call to a function from Azure and use it that way. Kendall, there's object storage? What is this?
There is object storage. So imagine you need to grab data from an S3 storage bucket. And S3 is popular in AWS,
Yes.
but it's actually
That's right.
It's an API. It's
Yep.
a standard that a lot of storage vendors
Store Simple,
offer.
lots of folks use that.
Absolutely. I know a handful of vendors who are here today offer
That's
that
right,
API.
that's right.
So
Pure, yep.
Pure is one of those. Imagine that you could make a call out to either backup to URL, where you need to back up your databases or restore your databases from S3 storage, or for Polybase, when you need to read the data that lives in S3 storage without having to go build complex applications
And join it
join
to
it together.
SQL data.
you can just make a T-SQL call from within SQL Server that reads from S3 storage, pulls your data in from an external table sitting in that storage, and query it with T-SQL.
And it's just a query. You're not importing. This is not ETL. It's a call.
It
So
just
very,
works.
Very, very useful, very much. We also have Azure Synapse Link. If you were in the demo this morning, you saw this. What we're able to do is give you near real-time analytics at scale using Synapse that connects the Synapse system to the local SQL server. We've also got maintenance windows. Sometimes we have to do work. We've got definable maintenance windows now inside Azure SQL, so you can make sure your code is not impacted by maintenance. Oh my gosh, there's so much
There is
going
a
on.
ton.
Listen, if you want to know more, definitely go get started out with aka.ms Azure SQL Fundamentals. Again, completely free and available to you. We definitely, if you want to take a shot of that, and you'll get this deck, of course, later. Let you guys see that one. Okay. All right, good stuff. All right, you got the camera shot. All right, listen, here's the QR code for the evaluations. Make sure you let the folks know how amazing Kendall did today.
And
we
Buck.
really appreciate what you've done, how you've come to this. It's great to see everybody in person again. Now you need to make your way to another session. More to learn. Thanks, everybody.